My name is Bill England, and I'm the president of WWP, and I welcome you here tonight for this excellent program, Encountering Awe, Science, Mysticism, and Poetry. First of all, I'd like to thank you for your wonderful financial support for 2019 and continuation in 2020. Your donations are needed and appreciated for our programming. Our next program will be Awe, Ethics, and River Conservation, which will be held on March 31st at Trinity Church. We are very happy to inform you that we are starting to work on our new program for fall of 2020. Before we start, we would like everyone at each table to introduce themselves and share whether this is the first time you have been at World Wisdom's Project event. We'll take a couple minutes.
So are you in awe of the night sky, or when you're out in nature, or do you experience awe listening to music or reading a poem, or the thought of a tiny human being developing in the womb, an awe-filled experience, or experience the talent of a really extraordinary person? Perhaps the aha of learning is your experience of awe. Is the experience mystical, a sudden feeling of something overwhelming, larger than yourself? So we'd like you to take a few minutes in quiet and reflect on an experience of awe that you've had, and use the blank paper on the page to write a few notes on it. And then we'll give you a few minutes, and then I'll gather us back again. So just thank you for your willingness to reflect on the experience of awe. And so keep your experience in mind as you listen to what the panelists are saying their experiences are. It might sound similar, or it might be something new in another way of experiencing awe. We'll come back to hear about your experiences in the second part of our program. Now I'd like to introduce our panelists here. I'm excited to have all of these panelists here tonight. To my right is Dr. Stephen Lundeen, who is a professor emeritus from Colorado State University. Steve taught classes in laser physics and modern optics while carrying out laboratory research with lasers and atomic and ionic beams. He's a fellow of the American Physical Society and a past chairman of the Division of Atomic, Molecular, and Optical Physics. I was interested in having a scientist share his experience or her experience as part of awe, but I was especially interested in having a scientist come who has to use very complicated equipment to look at his subject for research. And then down at the end is Stephen Hatch. He is a Christian contemplative with roots in Protestant and Catholic mysticism. He studied with Father Thomas Keating, that some of you probably know, and taught for contemplative outreach. He has developed an earth-based form of Christian mysticism that he calls wilderness mysticism, and he was interviewed recently for a film entitled The Unruly Mystic, John Muir. He teaches contemplative Christianity and has a spiritual direction practice. And Stephen's 2 books are on display at our information table. And in the middle sits Dan Beachy-Quick. He is a poet, an essayist, a translator, and author. Most recently of a book titled Silence and Song, and another book titled Variations on Dawn and Dusk. He's a Guggenheim Fellow. He's also a University Distinguished Teaching Scholar at Colorado State University, where he teaches creative writing and acts as assistant chair to the English department. His new book, Variations on Dawn and Dusk, is a work on awe and wonder, and was just named as finalist on the long list for the National Book Award in Poetry 2019. And those 2 books are over there on the table for you to peruse as well. Please give the panelists a warm welcome. So Steve Lundeen will start.
Here we are. I'm happy to be here. I have a little slideshow over here. I'm sorry that it's way in that direction, but I still think that it might help you to understand some of the things that I'm going to tell you about. First of all, I want to clarify that there's no way I can speak for all of physics. That's a huge subject. There's a staggering variety of questions and investigations that are going on in physics. But like most physicists, my professional experience was concentrated in a small area, working with atoms and molecules using lasers. So for many years now, I've worked in the laboratory using microwaves and lasers to study the behavior and the properties of atoms and ions. To give you an idea what this involves, I've shown a picture up here of me in the laboratory. You can't see it very well, but right in here you can see a tube of high vacuum equipment, stainless steel vacuum pipe that's connected to ultra-high vacuum pumps. And maybe you can imagine an accelerated beam of ions or atoms coursing through that system. And along the way, it would encounter a whole succession of electric, magnetic, microwave, and laser fields. And we would hope to learn something from that. But you can also see, perhaps, that there are wires everywhere. Right? There are some wires that are controlling the fields that are applied to the atoms, and other wires that carry out the signals that tell us from the sensors and detectors that are inside the system. Now, as a general rule, nothing that happens inside that system is visible to us. But we can infer what's happening from the signals that come out on those wires. Now, I've been doing this for many, many years. And in the process, I become very comfortable with atoms, although I can't see them. And I'm also comfortable with quantum mechanics and confident in its ability to describe the behavior of atoms. And I find all that extremely interesting, but not particularly awesome. It's just the way the world works, and I use it every day in the lab. It's familiar and it's reliable, not the stuff of awe and wonder. So I'm supposed to tell you where I do experience awe and wonder in the science lab. So let me try to do that. Basically, every once in a while, although mostly the behavior of atoms is entirely predictable, every once in a while they do something that's surprising and dramatic. Something that's entirely unexpected and really amazing. And those are the kind of events that I want to try to describe. When that happens, my first reaction is, wow, that's magical. That sounds like awe. But of course, as a scientist, I know it isn't magic. And so that stimulates I have to work hard to figure out what happened and why. It turns out that these particular kinds of awesome events are more common than you might imagine in science. And when they happen, they can interrupt the sort of normal flow of laboratory work and cause us to look at things in a different way and give insight and motivation for more work, and often very productive work. So, of course, I'm guessing that many of you have no idea what I'm talking about, right? So I will try to give you a couple specific examples of an awesome event of this type. Now, the first example happened, I'm showing a picture of our apparatus, when my students and I were trying to create what we call a Rydberg target. That is, we wanted to create a very dense collection of excited atoms that would be located right here. And that would form a collision target for positive ions that are coming out of this silver tube here. And in order to do that, we started with a a thermal beam of rubidium atoms that come up from the bottom through a small hole. And we aimed 3 different lasers directly at that spot where we wanted to have the target. Now, each of these lasers was at a wavelength that matched one transition in a sequence of transitions that led from the ground state of rubidium into this highly excited state that would form our Rydberg target. However, none of these 3 lasers was visible. They were all at wavelengths that the human eye doesn't see. So tuning those lasers was kind of tricky. We had to rely on indirect methods to tell when they were correctly tuned. For example, the first laser would be partially absorbed when it matched the transition up from the ground state to the first state in the ladder. And so anyway, we had other indirect methods that allowed us to tune the other 2 lasers. And when we had all 3 lasers tuned correctly, we confidently expected that we would have our desired Rydberg target. But since we expected that those excited atoms would decay back to the ground state by the same sequence of invisible transitions that we use to excite them, we did not expect to see anything, and we planned to rely on our indirect tuning methods. Well, the awesomeness occurred the first time we got all of the lasers tuned. Somebody looked into the vacuum system and exclaimed, "It's blue!" And it was clearly blue, as you can see. And this is in spite of the fact that we knew that this target state we were preparing did not spontaneously decay with the emission of any visible light. But there could be no doubt that our target was glowing bright blue. This was completely unexpected. It was directly visible. It was very dramatic. It was awesome. Yeah, we were stunned. And it took us many months to figure out why the atoms were behaving in this way. So that's one example of an awesome event in my experience. A second example happened when, it has to do with the homemade helium neon laser that I assembled many times in an instructional lab that I taught at CSU. It consists of a little glass tube, you see here, which is filled with helium and neon gas, and it can be excited by an electric discharge. It just glows pinkish red. It looks pretty ordinary, just like a neon lamp. But something quite remarkable can happen when you put 2 mirrors on opposite ends of the tube. If the mirrors are carefully adjusted to reflect exactly back along the axis of the tube, a bright red beam instantly appears, connecting the mirrors, and transmits through one of the mirrors at the end to form a laser beam. The first time I saw this, and of course I've seen it hundreds of times since, but every time I see it, I'm truly awed. It's pretty amazing to see something as obvious as a red laser beam that comes and goes when you turn a knob just slightly. So this is, I should also point out that it's not a trivial matter to adjust those mirrors to exactly go along the axis of the thing. It usually takes the students several hours of tedious work to achieve this. And when they finally get that magical red beam, it is always a surprise. And once you've seen this happen, you're very curious to know more about what's happening inside that tube. And with that heightened curiosity, there's lots of other measurements that we can carry out on this system and find quantitative numbers that can be compared to mathematical models of the laser operation that we talk about in the course. So this is the second example of awesome event, an event that has awed me in physics. Both of these events are unlike most of the things that atoms do because they're directly visible. But they both inspire wonder. And they really stimulate the need to learn more about what is happening and why. Thank you.
Awe and mysticism. What is mysticism? There's many different traditions in the world that describe mystical reality. But basically, mysticism is a sense of finding whatever the presence is that brought this cosmos into being, finding that sacred presence at the core of everything, at the core of ourselves and at the core of others, at the core of the natural world. And when we find that source at the core of things, we feel a sense of oneness with it. In other words, it's not out there. We feel a sense of union. And we feel this sense that it's a part of us and we're a part of it. At the same time, we realize that it's a source, the source of all it is, and so it's infinite. And we have a sense of longing to have a deeper union. And so there's both oneness and longing at the same time. And so the mystic enters life. I guess we're kind of an odd breed. We like our space, we like our solitude, we like to spend lots of time alone, and we're always questioning, where did everything come from? What is that source? We have this kind of a longing. We come into this world with this longing to somehow get back to our origin. And we find that in many ways, and every tradition has a different way to do it. I felt that at an early age. I felt socially awkward with the people around me who like to talk about ordinary things, and I didn't necessarily fit into the various social groups in elementary school and junior high. And I would have things like I would go to an alpine lake. I would hike 7 miles to an alpine lake in high school just to see the turquoise glow. I didn't care how much time it took or how much effort. I wanted to have that sense of wonder at that incredible glow of the water. And I lived for those kind of experiences. I teach at Naropa University, and I would say that most of the students there have that mystical kind of inclination. Mystics often have a sense of elation and then crash when the exciting experience dissipates, and they seek more and more of those kind of experiences of oneness, those peak experiences, those epiphanies. But mysticism starts as a child. So Jesus said that we need to be like little children if we're ever going to enter what he called the kingdom of heaven. And he recommended that we be born again. Well, the mystic wants to be born again every moment. And the mystic wants to be a child their whole life, even after we become an adult, to acquire kind of a second naivete, right? So that, you know how a little kid will go along the street and find a piece of trash and pick it up, you know, and just look at it and think it's the coolest thing, maybe a little piece of glittery plastic, and mom and dad go, "Oh, put that down, that's dirty." The kid has this sense of awe and wonder, and we all start out life that way, right? And as kids, we want to know, well, why is there anything instead of nothing? Well, the mystic seeks to retain that kind of mindset and heart set throughout all of life. And not just to experience all, but to experience oneness and a sense of connection and kind of a love affair, really, with that source that is within all things. Zen calls it beginner's mind, right? Zen Buddhism calls it the beginner's mind. To always be a beginner and to always feel that you're at the very beginning of anything that you're exploring. The mystical attitude is connected to contemplation. The contemplative disciplines are disciplines that foster a sense of oneness with the source that's at the core of us in all things. So we have disciplines that involve silence, solitude, simplicity of lifestyle, and listening. Why is that? Well, think of our society. Think of the previews to a movie. There's all this crashing and smashing, and I find it's quite an overload. But in our culture, we've increased the stimulation threshold so high that we have to have all of this hype going on to even experience our lives often. The contemplative wants to tone things down and enter a kind of silence so that the least thing emerging out of the silence is full of wonder and full of awe. So we practice meditative disciplines and silence and solitude in order to develop an attitude of listening to be able to find that source that is at the core of all things. As Christian mystics, we talk about how everything is a word of God. And of course, we refer to the ultimate mystery as God, and each tradition has a different word that they use. In the Hopi tradition, the word translates as the very something. In the Lakota tradition, it's the great mysterious. But you get the idea. It's this presence that beckons us. For the mystic, the awe comes especially from a sense of beauty. There's this aesthetic sense that whatever it is that's at the source of all things, that's within us and within all things, lures us. You know, like you see a beautiful sunset, like the one last Saturday night. It lures you into, you want to experience more of it. You want to know, how am I connected to this sunset? What does it speak about the rest of my life? You want it to last. So there's a sense of beauty that is at the heart of the Christian mystical experience and the mystical experience of all the different traditions. John Muir, one of my favorite mystics, he found a sense of beauty in the simplest things. He'd go into a forest and say, look how the light hits each pine needle and each twig. And he says it's just as though God put each twig and pine needle there in its position that very day. So we have a sense of mindfulness of being able to see that beauty in the simplest of things. But sometimes this sense of beauty knocks us over with a sense of awe. Ralph Waldo Emerson, one of Muir's friends, said, "This world is so beautiful, I can hardly believe it exists." So there is this incredible sense of beauty. But for the mystics, there is this sense of a peak experience or an epiphany that they have in one area of life, and then they want to find a way to continue that experience in the ordinary aspects of life. So there is this, so the sense of epiphany or peak experience and imagination and metaphor all go together in mysticism. What happens is we have an experience in one part of life, and then we want to find that same reality in the ordinary aspects of life. You think of Mother Teresa, right? She's caring for these dying people. So what does she do? She has an experience of Christ in her morning meditation. So then she sees Christ in these dying people that she's serving. Thich Nhat Hanh has a devotion to the Buddha. So then he says, you know, washing dishes seems like a boring sort of thing to do. He says, wash the dishes like you're washing the baby Buddha, right? So there's this sense of being able to transfer the epiphany from one area to another. And that's where metaphor comes in. The word metaphor means to carry across from one realm to another. And so each of the mystics seeks to do that. I had one experience where that happened with me. I was camping near Echo Amphitheater, which is a concave sandstone amphitheater in the Georgia O'Keeffe country in northern New Mexico. And as you hike, you start at the state highway where there's cars, then you hike through several different layers of pinyon and juniper trees, and then you're up next to this beautiful orange and yellow and beige sandstone amphitheater that was formed during the Jurassic period. As you stand next to that amphitheater, you hear echoes of the cars on the highway that are behind you, but you can't hear the original sounds because the cars are hidden, the sounds are hidden by those rows of trees. Same thing happened with Coyote Calls. I camped there once, and you could hear echoes of the Coyote Calls off the amphitheater, but you couldn't hear or see the original coyotes. Well, that gave my mystical intuition or realization, this is something about how all of reality is. So that while in that particular experience, well, I could just hike back to the highway and see the cars, right? Or I could just go where the coyotes are and see them. It made me realize, in the spiritual dimension, actually, there aren't any cars and there aren't any coyotes, there's only echoes. So mystics do that, they make these kind of connections, so the natural experience points to this kind of transcendent experience. So I developed a meditation method where I would seek to find everything in life as a kind of echo arising out of nowhere. And for a mystic, that nowhere is their consciousness itself. Mysticism seeks at root to find the sacred in the midst of their own consciousness. So they have different techniques and disciplines to get in touch with the spaciousness of their mind, for example, as in Tibetan meditation. And then out of that spaciousness of your own awareness, everything is arising as the creation out of no thing. So there's an example where the experience I had in northern New Mexico gave me a hint at what is happening in everyday life. And then the key is to practice that insight in everything around us, and so bring the epiphany, the peak experience into everyday life. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve and Stephen and Linda. I have to say, it's inspiring that there's on a winter night that this many people gather together to think about wonder and awe. It's really remarkable. I'm grateful to be among all of you. As I was thinking about our topic tonight, I had this feeling that that awe in some way is very difficult to categorize as an experience. At one level it feels so vastly larger than whatever the word experience can capture, and at the same time it feels as fundamental as an atom. There's an atomic level of awe that is somehow always more than experience and less than experience and never quite experience itself. And I thought what I might do is simply share 3 short texts that have become for me a way to begin doing this difficult work about thinking about a thing that is in some ways unthinkable. And I thought I might share those with you and just offer some very brief thoughts these texts have given me. And the first is from Plato's book Cratylus, which is his dialogue on the origin of words and the origin of language. And as I read this, it will sound hopelessly, if not obnoxiously, academic. I apologize for that. It's actually very playful and silly. Socrates has this wonderful and maddening habit of making up the histories of words. He creates these false etymologies to make his point. And I'll read the words he's playing with in the Greek, and if you listen closely, you'll hear these sounds he's playing with to make a very beautiful and poetic point. So Socrates is speaking back to Cratylus. Wisdom, phronesis, for it is perception, noesis, and flowing, rue, or it might be understood as benefit, onesis, of motion, phoros. In either case, it has to do with motion. And episteme, knowledge, indicates that the soul which is of any account accompanies epitai, things in their motion, neither falling behind them nor running in front of them. Therefore, we ought to enter the letter epsilon and call it episteme. Certainly, Sophia, wisdom, denotes the touching of motion. This word is very obscure and of foreign origin. But we must remember that the poets often say of something which begins to advance rapidly, essufe, it rushed. There was a famous Laconian whose name was Seuss Rush, for this is the Laconian word for rapid motion. Now, Sophia signifies the touching, apethe, of this rapid motion, the assumption being that things are in motion. And one of the ways I've come to think about this is one, to remember that Socrates' particular capacity of wonder, and maybe it holds true especially for myself as a poet, is that whatever thinking is or whatever knowledge is, it seems not to be a process of stepping back away from the object that you want to think about. It's not finding a distance that makes a reasonable or even rational sense. It's actually quite the opposite, that the poet's relationship to thinking is to step closer to the motion of things, to get into the proximity of them, for some understanding like Stephen was just talking about, that there's a larger motion mining its way through the world entire, and the poet's hope is to find a language that doesn't describe it merely, but is a form of participation in it. The next text comes from a letter written at the very end of December in 1817. John Keats writing to his two brothers, both younger, John and Tom. And he's complaining just before he says this, and these letters, if you haven't read them, are, as a teacher of mine said, one of the primary documents of soul making in the world. They're filled with the daily, they're funny, they're anecdotes, and then they'll have these moments of just insight so profound it shocks you, and then he starts telling a joke again. You know, they're these daily maps of what a mind is actually capable of if it's actually paying attention to the world in itself. So just before this, you should know he's complaining about getting drunk too often lately. And he says, I had not a dispute, but disquisition with a friend of his, Dilka, on various subjects. Several things dovetailed in my mind, and at once it struck me what quality went to form a man of achievement, especially in literature, and what Shakespeare possessed so enormously. I mean negative capability. That is, when man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. Coleridge, for instance, would let go by a fine, isolated verisimilitude caught from the penetralium of mystery, from being incapable of remaining content with half-knowledge. This, pursued through volumes, would perhaps take us no further than this, that with a great poet, the sense of beauty overcomes every other consideration, or rather, obliterates all consideration. And this is one of the most famous passages from 19th century literature, something, this idea of negative capability, taught across the nation still in programs where poetry is the core of the concern. And there's this way that there's a kind of strange appropriateness Keats is encouraging us towards, that the proper form of knowledge isn't the one that's seeking after an answer to the question you might have, but a way to dwell more properly in the difficulty of a question that has no obvious answer. And that has been a long encouragement for me of what I want poetry to offer, which isn't the solution, but a way to stay courageous in places of doubt. And lastly, there's a poem from a poet I much love, who has a fascinating life I'd be glad to talk about another time. A man named George Oppen, 20th century poet. And the poem is called Psalm. In the small beauty of the forest, the wild deer bedding down, that they are there. Their eyes effortless, the soft lips nuzzle and the alien small teeth tear at the grass. The roots of it dangle from their mouths, scattering earth in the strange woods. They who are there. Their paths nibbled through the fields, the leaves that shade them hang in the distances of sun, the small nouns crying faith in this in which the wild deer startle and stare out. And there's a way I've come to think of that poem that's tied to one of the words of knowledge that Socrates used in that dialogue, the Cratylus, this idea of the episteme, of this ground in some way of what it might be to know that you know. That seems like such an isolated and individual capacity, but here we have a poem where the episteme, the ground of knowing, is so radically not that of isolation. In fact, it's stepping into the woods and startling the deer who, looking up, see you, and you're startled at their own awareness of yourself. There is this way in this poem in which there's a claim that the truest knowing one can do isn't at all something that one can build oneself, but the most honest realization of the existence of one's own life among the existence of everything else that's living along with you, in a world itself that has this sacred possibility, apparently, of being actual, of being an isness, a thing that is somehow undeniable, that's co-made and reciprocal. And the deer staring at us, staring at it, are as knowing in this world as I suppose we ourselves are.
So now we have a few minutes before we take a pause, and so I'm going to ask the panelists if you'd like to ask a question. So whoever would like to ask a question of someone else on the panel.
I would like to ask a question of Steve, but I imagine Stephen has things to say about it too. I found myself oddly fascinated by the tedium of adjusting mirrors and just at some larger level thinking about how much work that seems the exact opposite of wonder and awe goes into the possibility of wonder and awe being felt. And I think I'm wondering about, I would just love to hear you talk a bit more about that daily, mundane quality of work.
Well, you're certainly right that there is a lot of tedium, and that is really what heightens the experience, I think. I mean, for example, if you think of the experience of students trying to adjust those mirrors, and the hours go by when nothing happens. And then, when they get that last knob turned exactly right, wow, there's a red laser beam. So it's really the tedium that makes the experience so special. And the same thing is true in the other example. If these things were easy to do, you wouldn't have the same reaction to them.
And is there something similar in the hiking the 7 miles, the work to get to the place of contemplation?
Yes. Oftentimes what happens in a mystic's life is they have some kind of a peak experience and it disappears, right? It disappears. And so then you have the work of disciplining your life in order that that sort of thing might emerge again. And so there is a lot of hours. Just ask anybody who meditates. Everybody says the same thing. Right? I can't meditate. I have too many thoughts when they're trying to get to the silence. So that many, many hours of ordinary meditations, ordinary periods of silence, loneliness, doubt, and all of that. And so one puts up with all of that and keeps moving, and lo and behold, that blue light comes again in the midst of that silence. But yes, many, many hours of discipline. And after a while, you don't really seek the experiences as separate from you. After a while, what happens is the experience comes right within the midst of the practice. So that it isn't an object that comes to you, but the practice itself becomes the experience.
So So I think we'll take a short break right now, so refresh your drinks, chat with one another, and then come back in about 5 minutes. So what we'd like you to do now is to, at your tables, talk, and we'd like you to talk about 2 things. One is, what was your takeaway from the first session here with the panelists? What did you find that was important to you, your takeaway? And then second, what is something that you might like to know a little bit more about, that you didn't quite understand, or it kind of intrigued you and you wanted to hear a little bit more? So we could take about 5 minutes and share amongst yourselves about those 2 things. What was your takeaway, and what would you like to know a little bit more? So that everybody can hear your question. So, does someone have a question?
Hi, I'm Dave, and I have a question for Stephen, the physicist. And as a dramatic layperson in science, I'm looking at illustration 4, where the laser beam is coming out of a mirror, and I'm wondering how that's possible.
Well, if you look carefully at that picture, you will see that this is a little bit of photographic trickery. What actually happens, as I explained, is when the mirrors are perfect, all of a sudden a red beam appears that's going back and forth between the mirrors. And you don't see that in that picture, because it's very difficult to capture that photographically. But I felt it would be still helpful to have that picture here, because you can see the beam on the other side of the mirror. Now, what happens in practice is the mirror is 2% transmitting. And so the intense beam that's going back and forth between the outside mirrors actually transmits partially through that end mirror, and that's what creates the output beam from the laser. But I apologize for the trickery.
Another question? David, can you wait for the microphone? It's coming up.
I have a question pertaining, or for all 3 of you. When we first wrote down our imaginations of awe, I wrote the vastness of the universe, the vastness of the ocean, and quantum physics. Because when you take all of these, in my mind, they're all very, very similar, and they're all so incredibly different. So what this led, when I listened to the 3 of you, I kept thinking, you try to achieve, or you do achieve a moment of awe, no doubt, all 3 of you. What about the path that you took to get to that moment of awe? Wasn't that also awesome, the whole path that you work on?
Pam?
I'm sorry.
I mean, the pun to make is that's an awful question. By which one would mean a full of awe question in the old sense of where that word comes from. I think that sense of the entire path revealing itself as deeply and fundamentally embedded in the kind of arrival at those moments of awe is a really insightful one. And I really heard Stephen talking about that when he was talking about how the practice, the habit of that practice becomes in some ways even more overwhelming than the so-called overwhelming moments. And I've certainly now that I've been basically simply wanting in my life to write a good poem for 30 years. It's been countless hours of reading poems and writing them and being in language in such a way that your echo chamber, I can imagine the entire mind as a kind of echo chamber, which is to say, I have been in language and with words so long that I understand that at some level, I'm not saying any of those words for the first time. None of us are saying them for the first time. They were uttered and given meaning by generations who have come to consciousness via these same words that I'm trying to do the same work within a poem, to come to a realization that can last in a meaningful way, at least through my life. And that sense of this long path and journey to the art it is I'm trying to practice has become the thing that is most dear to me.
I have a question for you, Stephen Hash, but I hope it's okay if I'm right over here, but I hope if it's okay if I just say that if I could say something about what I'm noticing, because we were talking at the table about, that poets are, I hope I can say, somewhat in the practice of awe, seeing the awe in the mundane, that there's a struck moment of not knowing. So anyway, so that's why I'm particularly interested in something you said about in my daily life, walking through it and experiencing every version of the echo, and it's being transcendent, and then maybe not even worrying what it refers back to. And so I'd love to know if you could give some examples about that in everyday life.
I think in everyday life, a lot of it comes out of the meditative. So the mystic works a lot on themselves. They work a lot on their own sense, their own awareness, and instead of identifying with their thoughts and emotions, to identify with the silence. And so what happens then is, as you start to identify with the silence more and awareness itself, which Buddhists would talk about as spacious, like the sky, suddenly you realize that everything is emerging out of that awareness. Everything. Every thought, every emotion, every event. And so everything becomes chock full of wonder. Because it's coming, in a sense, it's coming out of you. So suddenly the thing that you had in the peak experience is actually happening constantly. If you want me to give another practical example, I find that, so what happens is you develop that sense of silence and that sense of spaciousness. Okay, so I take each of my Naropa students out for coffee to hear about their spiritual journey. And I'm just in awe at their journeys. A lot of it comes from being silenced, not me trying to think about what to say next, but listening to their experience is completely unique. It's got their own idiosyncrasies, and they're a completely unique Word of God. Another example is when I do photography. I do a lot of landscape photography, and when I go out with an open mind and I don't have too much of an idea of what kind of project I want, things come to me. I mean, animals appear, things just happen around you. It's like they're saying, take my picture, you know? Once you find it in one place, then suddenly it occurs everywhere. So the purpose of the peak experience is to give you the attitude that then you bring back to everyday life, to find it in the ordinary. It's not to dwell in the peak experience, because those are going to eventually disappear, as they should, so that you can find it right here and now. Yeah. Thanks, that's a great question.
Thank you. My name is Jim, and I'm a Jesuit educator from Seattle. And I recall over the life of my career with my colleagues laboring over how do you teach this stuff. So my question to the panel is, how do you teach this stuff?
Well, I think there's some quite immediate humble realization, certainly that I have as a teacher, every time really I walk into the class, that that what would be most important to be able to offer isn't something that's actually teachable in some way, or at least it's not teachable in the sense that I can provide a method or a guarantee that this class is going to arrive at a moment that has so much awe in it that it, in some ways, the only proper response is a kind of silence, that one feels one has come to a kind of realization, and that realization, oddly enough, for a class in poetry is unspeakable. But what a teacher can do, I think, is continually show up and demonstrate the particular kind of humility, vulnerability, rigor, generosity, and discipline of what it is to try to read a poem in such a way that the possibility of that awe is available to everyone who can follow suit. And the gift of the classroom is that what is typically a profoundly isolate activity, just as Stephen was talking about the mystical practice, and I imagine there's many solitary hours in the lab, that the classroom offers a chance where something is shared, that isn't typically in our lives shareable at all, and that communal moment when one comes to a realization of this thing a poem holds in it. I think it just happens a few times in a career, and sometimes you get vestiges of it in small ways more often, but it's really a remarkable occurrence when it happens. Mostly you fail.
Dan, I'm wondering, you shared when we were meeting to talk about this, a situation where you read a poem in the class and that moment of silence occurred. And I'm just curious, did you do something to prep the students to understand the poem, or what happened before you read the poem that the moment of silence occurred?
So this was a class that at the time was doing a real deep dive into Keats's letters, actually. And I don't know how many of you know the story of John Keats's life, but it's a tragic, like genuinely tragic story. He died just after he turned 25 from consumption, the disease that killed his mother, whom he nursed almost all the way to her death, that killed his youngest brother, who he nursed to his death, and then he caught the disease himself at the moment that he had fallen in love for the first time. He was trained as a doctor. He had no money. His other brother left for America with pretty much the rest of the money that the family had. And Keats, on a strangely balmy February day, went out, and in order to save money, went out without his coat, and in order to save money, got a ride back in a carriage sitting on the outside as a storm blew in, and knocked on the door of the house he was sharing with his friend Charles Brown, and coughed up 2 cups of blood, and looked at it and said, "I know the color of that blood. That's arterial blood, and that's my death sentence." And sure enough, for the next year and a half, he was dying, and as he was dying, wasn't able to write anymore. But the work that he did in that summer of 1819, within a 6-month period, that man wrote the 6 poems for which he is immortal in this language. It's a spark of genius that has seldom ever been witnessed. And in the midst of writing those poems, he's aware of his death coming. They're filled with a kind of self-knowledge of this doom that's uniquely his, even as he's writing about a doom that is everyone's and a beauty that is everyone's. And so all of us were so deeply immersed in his life, and then we all took turns reading stanza by stanza, Ode to a Nightingale, and you get to the end of that poem, after the word forlorn wakes him from his dream, and he doesn't know whether he sleeps or wakes. And there was this way that one felt the entire consciousness of that poem come to life in that room, that it was remarkably available by the unique fingerprint of Keats's own life, and then so strangely that fingerprint pressed itself upon our own minds and hearts and was for a little while our own. And there's just this sense that there was not a thing one could say. And we left. We just, like, and not, it wasn't like I said, well, let's go early. It's like, we all just kind of, one by one, stood up and walked out of the room. It was a moment.
Stephen, would you like to add anything to?
I got so lost in the poem. It reminded me of the questioning.
Question again. It's beautiful. Oh, can you teach it? Yes. Well, one of the best things that you can do is cross that cattle guard up Poudre River, and you don't have any more cell phone service. I think the cell phone is one of the most difficult things in our lives. I have you say GIF or GIF? There's a picture, you know, the thinker, there's a picture of him, you know, thinking. I can't do it right here. And he's got this. with his cell phone. So I think that, yeah, there's a sense of teaching a kind of fasting, except for us, I think in these days fasting is not so much from food, but it's from that constant stimulation, that constant things happening, which we're always seeking on our phone, right? And another hit of a like or a comment or something like that. To have times when you let go of that. One of the best ways to do that is to go outside. So I have a lot of students at Naropa, they can't meditate in a row. So what I do is I take them out to the park outside. We go out to Chautauqua Park. And suddenly they can meditate. Suddenly they can let go of their thoughts. Suddenly they listen to the crows and the birds, and whatever their cultural ADD seems to go away, and they can open themselves to something brand new. So I think the outdoors and a certain fasting from our constantly wired lifestyle are two things that I recommend.
Other questions?
Can I just want to add one thing to that too, on the question of how we teach that. And to me, it all revolves around actually getting your hands on things, doing things in the lab and seeing what actually happens. Most of the time that we spend in science class is reading the textbook and, you know, working out problems with your pencil or whatever. And for me, it just has always been the key is actually getting your hands on equipment, turning the knobs, seeing things happen. And that's, so when I think that actually having lab experience in physics, or in, I suppose in any science, although I can really only speak for physics, is the key way to introduce people to the sort of awesomeness of the physical world.
I have a question for you, Stephen. I'm thinking of, hi. I'm thinking of Christian mysticism, and as I understand it, Sufism is the mystic arm of the Islam tradition, is that correct?
Yes.
So my question is, in all of the major world religions, is it possible that there's a mystic tradition that's associated with that?
Yes.
Yes? Oh, amazing.
Yeah, every tradition has that impulse toward oneness, toward awe and wonder, toward union. Yeah, so, you know, in Judaism it's Kabbalah, in Christianity it's contemplative Christianity, much of Buddhism, much of Hinduism, much of Taoism, and then, yeah, Sufism in Islam. And then, of course, we have the phenomenon now of the spiritual but not religious. What I hear from my students now is plant medicines. That's like a new religion. I mean, probably 3/4 of the students that I go out for coffee with, some sort of psychotropic drug has been their initiation into a mystical experience. But yeah, it's one of the it's unfortunately something the news doesn't focus on, you know, but there's a oneness there between all the traditions, and they're all a different lens. They're not experiencing the same thing, but it's kind of like that image of the blind people try to describe the elephant. So one tradition touches the tusk and says it's hard, you know, and another one touches the mouth and says it's soft, another touches the belly and says it's wide, another touches the leg and says it's narrow. They're all right and they're all wrong. And so we need each other. We need each of the traditions as a different lens onto that common experience. And that's what I find with the contemplative or mystical traditions. They understand that. They are more similar to each other than other people in their own religion that have a more sort of black and white, you know, version of reality.
That's what it seems like, that the idea of oneness is such a unifying
Yeah.
idea. Thank you.
Yeah, but there's an appreciation for the differences too. Yeah, wow, you know, you suddenly you have an experience where you're seeing something through someone else's eyes, and that's really amazing.
So what's your experience of oneness?
What is my
One experience of your oneness.
what is one experience of the oneness? Okay, I'm seeking and I am seeking and seeking for an answer, and suddenly the question flips back on itself. And I realized the question is already its own answer. I went through an experience where I was longing and longing for God. I was at a monastery. And why can't I have this experience? Why does everyone else have this experience and I don't? And suddenly something happened where I realized, oh, of course my longing isn't going to go away, because my longing for the divine is the divine's longing for me. And I could just rest in my longing, rest in the question. The question becomes its own answer.
So I have, I've been hearing from each of you, and it's a, it's a voice from somewhere. And it's something that Dan? No, Dan had said, and I'm paraphrasing you, so pardon me if I get it incorrect, but poetry is really striving for a language that doesn't describe it, but allows you to participate in it. And as Steve, the physicist, was saying, it's not reading the textbook anymore, it's getting your hands on it. And then as I was formulating that, then you basically say the same thing with the meditation. And so I'm not really sure what the question is, but can you speak to that theme that I'm hearing across all three of you?
You know, one of the poetry is a strange practice and a strange thing to teach, and a strange path, back to David's question from earlier, in part because it uses a medium that students are already so fluent in that they don't even know the tool is a tool in some kind of way. And a lot of what a practice in poetry is figuring out that you have to use language in such a way that you can come to the understanding that even a thought in the end is a kind of hand-built thing. And when you get to that sense that even thinking is a kind of active, rigorous, faulty, flawed, filled with hope and filled with failure kind of activity, you realize that the thinking that is happening in that poem is no longer just a description of a fact or a world. Like the poem is somehow so unexpectedly a kind of participation in the ongoing work of creation, an ongoing work of world. And there's a smidge, at the very least, of the mystical experience and such things, and some sense that, you know, like maybe one of the ways that a very diverse panel, disciplinary-wise, is bonded is that at some level, each one of us is at work trying to discover these origins and patterns by which the cosmos functions and ourselves in it. And I've really come to a sense that a poem is a particular kind of laboratory in that kind of, in that very sense. It's getting your hands into something of the making of the world, I think.
I'll stand up so you know where I am. Two questions, if that's okay. One contemplative question and one writer question. I'm sorry, I don't have a physics question. I'm not a physicist. First question, you've shared a couple different spiritual practices with us already. I'm wondering if you have maybe just one more spiritual practice that's been really meaningful to you in your life, and just kind of like the practical hands-on application of that in daily life. And then writer question is, in writing about that moment of awe or that moment of wonder, I think I am in a grad program and I do a lot of writing, and I think for me, I often get to the place where everything feels like a cliche, or everything feels like something that's been said before, or it doesn't fully capture that moment in its essence. Any just like practical tips for feeling stuck in that place, and what you do to try to keep writing into that experience in its fullness?
For me, a major practice is journaling. To go to a place, because sometimes you get blocked, like you don't know what you're feeling or what's your deepest desire. I like to go to a beautiful place that is silent, but that stimulates my imagination. And I just start writing, and I just write. And what happens, it becomes a mystical practice, because oftentimes something starts to come through you. You didn't know it before you started to write it down. You know, it just kind of comes through you. I mean, I think it's the same with any art, right? You don't have the answer, or you don't know exactly what you're doing, you just start doing it. And so I find journaling is really helpful for me. I journal just about every day, and when I can't do it up in the mountains, if it's too cold, I go to a coffee shop. Yeah, that's one of the most helpful practices that I can think of.
The writing question is a hard one. One of it is that, like, one could understand that cliches are also a kind of holy ground in some way. Like, they only seem dull to us in their use of language, in part because we've lost a sense of how wondrous the common is. And to write that you might arrive honestly at a place of cliche, the poem as an arrival at that will undo the risk of the cliche actually being cliche. It's an arrival at a place where people have worthily come before. At the same time, the poem has to do something with the language that like unsettles the mind enough that the surprise of the common can actually be a surprise. And one of the ways might be to slightly reframe what the work of the poem is, which maybe isn't to describe that place of arrival or achieve or encapsulate or envelope that awe, but the poem in some ways, I mean, it goes back to David's question, it is a kind of path towards it, right? The poem is the labor to arrive at something that you may or may not arrive at. And when you begin to understand the poem as a form of hoped-for encounter, rather than the presence of that encounter already being within it, then the poem is automatically charged with the kind of questing and questioning that will undo some of those fears.
Thank you, Bill. Let's see, I'm wondering if one of you, or perhaps someone in the audience, could speak to the physiology of awe. And what leads me to that is the discussion coming back to students and children. And I'm thinking about the differences in brain development and neurotransmitters that are available to children that are no longer available to adults, because if we all had the curiosity of children as we grew, we would short circuit, because children find everything curious. So I'm thinking of, I can't pull it back, Howard, maybe you can help, or someone, the particular neurotransmitter, is it, that's brain-derived, BDNF, can you help Linda?
Howard, do you have anything? I can say a little bit here. This is actually quite an interesting area of research, and a scientist named Jennifer Steller's been doing a lot of physiological research, subjecting students, you know, the perfect lab rat for university professors, to different experiences of awe, and then measuring what goes on, you know, in terms of the chemicals in their body. And it's at Berkeley, and they're finding very positive responses in the body to awe, that it's pleasurable, that it calms them, and that it's health-giving to them. Do you have anything else to add?
It's a complex question to answer, but to kind of bring this thought into a kind of a major concept. You know, what's going on in our brains, the energy goes wherever your mind goes. And it's quite interesting when you look fundamentally at the evolution of our brains. The brains are organized structurally and functionally in terms of two basic patterns. They're fundamentally organized. You see this pattern phylogenetically, that all organisms, all living organisms have sort of a basic behavioral structure. They're designed either when they are in a situation where they're responding, the brains are organized so that they're either attracted to something or they have to defend themselves from something. And as evolution occurs, your consciousness probably has much more control over it. So that's why awe and being awake are so incredibly powerful, because you can shift that axis to being attracted to things and being awake, or you can shift that axis to be afraid of something. And I see that poetry, meditation, and doing science, you're just looking for beauty and looking for your curiosity is activated. All of these are driving your brain in the growth pattern, the attractive pattern, and you have control over that. So that's the fundamental axis that any form of life has within its behavioral repertoire. And we have such really incredible power to drive it however we want to, but it takes a lot of discipline.
I'm wondering if the panelists would like to ask a question of each other.
What is the connection between awe in our respective fields and keeping us having a youthful attitude, that we stay young? I mean, for example, a lot of scientists I know, they're like kids. And I love it. I love it because they're eternally youthful, because they're always exploring some new thing and they never think they have it all. The same with the poet. You know, you're constantly seeking that next poem and that next sense of wonder of life. So I was wondering if you two could address that.
Well, I think that sounds true to me. I always felt that my job as a physicist was to do things that no one else had ever done. And, you know, maybe they were important things, maybe they were not important things, but my job was always to try to do something with atoms or lasers that hadn't been done before. For example, that little Rydberg target with the blue light that we talked about, no one had ever made one of those, and it proved to be a really useful thing that we used for many, many years for lots of different experiments. But that's kind of just one way to express the fact that it was always exciting. I mean, I was never doing anything that anybody had ever done before, as long as I could get it done. And that was a lot of fun for many, many years.
The question reminds me of one of my favorite anecdotes about a writer I love, the French essayist Montaigne, who would write in his study, and when he couldn't write, would kind of lean back and stare up at the ceiling, and had etched into the ceiling a scale you weigh things on, and the phrase, "I don't know." And it reminds me of a part of a book I recently read that just had this as a kind of meditation that said, the author is reminding himself that as the area of one's knowledge grows, so does the circumference of one's ignorance. And I think I feel that very much, you know, that I really feel like I don't know.
I'm wondering if someone from the audience would like to share one of their experiences of.
Well, at least I think it's a question. First of all, thank you so much. It's been absolutely fascinating. I can't think of a better way to spend an evening in my first month in Fort Collins. I always, when I listen to these sorts of panel discussions, I always kind of look for a unifying principle in the phrases that are being offered for contemplation. And one of the phrases that struck me, and I believe it was you, Stephen, you mentioned just in passing, showing courage in the face of doubt, which I take to mean the unknown, the uncertain, or maybe even the unknowable. And then Dan, you made the point about in the Socrates readings about moving toward the mystery. Steve, you mentioned the openness of the scientist, something I believe Paul mentioned, beyond the facts. In all of these cases, and in the comment by our neuroscientist folks here, the shifting of the energy toward the attractive axis, in all of these, I see this central theme of moving toward the mystery and not reaching for the comfortable, or in the case of your cell phones, the diversionary. Another way of not showing courage in the face of doubt. If there was one thing that you all, with your vast experience, could offer to us in terms of a practical way of keeping focused. I mean, maybe it's something as simple as taking a sticky with wine, putting it on your forehead, I don't know. But in some way that we can continue to show that courage in the face of doubt, uncertainty, the unknowable.
There's a line from a poem that, the whole poem means much to me, but this line is something that feels maybe related to the quite beautiful point you're kind of making by hand in front of us. And it's a poem actually so astonishingly written by a man who's a prisoner of war for treason in a cage outside Pisa, Italy. Ezra Pound, who is coming to some sense in an odd way of his own monstrosity. And he writes this, he says, "To do instead of not doing, this is not vanity." And what I've taken that to mean is part of what it is to be courageous in those spaces of doubt, and part of the advice for you and your writing question is that one has to, and your question too, is that one has to have this courage to do the thing. And whether that's the tedium of mirrors, or the tedium of writing a sonnet, or the tedium of a 15-mile hike to get to a summit, it's not vanity to go about doing.
I think there's the sense of enjoying the question itself. And sticking with the question, not looking for easy answers, maybe not finding an answer at all, but maybe realizing the entire universe is a divine question.
I was just going to add a little physiology to your question. And what comes to my mind is this beautiful experiment. See, within the brain you have a fear center. And then, of course, you have growth centers. But what's this interesting experiment is that they've designed an animal so that they can selectively inhibit or block, the activity in the fear center. And here's what's interesting. when they do that in an animal, for example, the entire cortex is activated. Well, you know, it's the cortex where you're integrating and processing all this incredible information. So, you know, fear is a big part of it. And of course, the other end of the spectrum, you have imagination and hope. So, and fear is the default position in the organization of the brain. It has to be shut down. So, control your fears.
Thank you. One last question here from the group.
First of all, thank you, all three of you. This intersection is really fascinating to me, between science and mysticism. I guess the question I have is, I can pinpoint certain experiences that got me interested in science or got me interested in mysticism. If you could describe maybe at least one, or maybe the most fundamental experience that pushed you in the direction as far as this being a realm of curiosity, like physics, poetry, or mysticism, if that makes sense.
I'd say life suffering. I think that is the gas that fuels the spiritual journey. And for me, I didn't fit in. I was an awkward kid. I got made fun of because I was sensitive, constantly made fun of, longing I could not get rid of, and that pushed me in the direction of seeking something deeper. But I have to say, I think that's one thing that's a part of awe in general. It would be amazing in this room to see each person some sort of a difficulty they overcame and how they overcame it. That is one of the most awe-inspiring things of human beings. It's truly the taking the grit of sand and making a pearl out of it.
I think really the transformative moment came for me in high school. I had a teacher who was actually capable of teaching poetry. And that's rare, really, at any level. I don't even know if I can do it yet. And I was in love for the first time with a young woman who is my wife now, is here, actually. And the poem was John Donne's A Valediction Forbidding Mourning. And it's a very difficult metaphysical poem. It begins, as virtuous men pass mildly away and whisper for their souls to go. Some of their sad friends do say the soul goes now, and some say no. And it goes on trying to find a way to find the right metaphor for what it is for this man to leave the woman that he loves, and ends with this kind of extraordinary metaphor of if our souls are two, they're two as a stiff twin compasses two, where if one has to travel and far roams, the other leans and hearkens after it. And you can imagine the little mathematical tool to draw circles, that when you spread it wide, the fixed foot does lean and hearken after it, and brings the circle just and grows erect as it comes back home. And I realized that a poem's difficulty isn't how abstract it is. A poem's difficulty is how accurate it is. And that poems are these vehicles of accuracy and precision about the feelings we have in us that seem like they are so large they should have no equivalent, and yet they do. And then I was done. I was like, there's no other work for me. Yeah, yes, that.
I think for me too, it was in high school. I just started to be entranced with the way you could explain so many things with a very simple equation. And it captured me. It was especially a contrast to the way I felt about chemistry class. So I fell in love with physics, and I always studied it after that, and it's been great fun.
Well, can we give this panel a great hand? If you'd like to get on our email list, there's a sheet over there to sign up to get on our email list. And our next program will be on March 31st. It'll be at Trinity Lutheran Church on Stewart. And the topic is awe and environmental ethics. And we'll have a philosopher, Katie McShane, CSU professor in philosophy, and Kurt Fausch, he's a retired professor from CSU, also in the wildlife and fish department. He's a stream ecologist, and they'll both be quite interesting. So do come again. Thank you very much.